Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's my honor today to speak to my private member's bill, Bill C-346, an act to amend the Firearms Act and licenses. I'm just going to go over some of the basics of it, Mr. Speaker, then I'll talk about it a little bit more at length. The aim of this bill is to ensure that no law-abiding firearms owner is criminalized for an administrative issue. The proposed changes reflect the success of the RCMP continuous eligibility system, which verifies the validity and conditions of license requirements every day. The bill also creates an avenue for an individual to voluntarily relinquish their license. And some key points about what this legislation does do, and I'll speak to some myths, I guess, that are out there that people just aren't sure about what it does or what it doesn't do. It amends the Firearms Act to eliminate the expiry of firearms licenses with a mandatory provision that the license holder update their relevant information every 10 years. And Mr. Speaker, I've been talking with other parties in this House, and I'm open to amendments as long as it doesn't affect my bill extremely. So I've been in conversations already with that, and we'll discuss them more as they come to me. An individual whose license has not been updated will not be able to purchase a firearm or ammunition. An individual if they fail to update their information, the license becomes suspended. The suspension is subsequently canceled as soon as the holder provides the necessary basic information. No license may be revoked simply because it is suspended. Number 4, the last provision, the relinquishment section allows an individual who no longer desires to possess a firearms license to voluntarily relinquish their license to a chief firearms officer with no negative consequences. And Mr. Speaker, what I've said before, I've done some videos on Facebook and Twitter, and I use the character Grandpa Joe. And the desire is that Grandpa Joe not become a criminal simply because his license expires. Many people that are firearms owners in Canada have gone through the process of getting their license. They've done their diligence. They've gone through the processes. They're very safe, law-abiding firearms owners. And simply because their license expires, what can happen today, and I've heard some really interesting stories about people whose firearms license have expired and literally the doors bashed down 7 days later because they're in illegal possession of their firearms. This is how dramatic of an event can happen just because something expires, and that's what I'm trying to get to the bottom of. And poor Grandpa Joe forgets to renew his license and get 5-year limitations and forgot to renew his license, and now is not just a person that has failed to do something, but now actually a criminal. That's the way our system looks at that particular Grandpa Joe. The analogy that I've used often is I use a vehicle owner, for instance, and I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, you own a vehicle. I own a few. And
I'd like to interrupt for a moment. I'm really interested in what the honourable member has to say, but there's voices rumbling in the background. It's making it very difficult. I'm sure everybody is looking forward to the weekend and talking to each other, which is nice, but if they don't mind either whispering or maybe talking in the lobby. The honourable member.
Yeah, I guess, Mr. Speaker, that's a good sign we have an audience today on this Friday afternoon, so that's not all bad, hey? Across the way, too, so that's good. But the comparison that I've used is a vehicle owner, for instance, and let's say your driver's license expires, Mr. Speaker. Just because you own a vehicle and it sits out on your driveway, certainly you wouldn't be allowed to operate it, but that vehicle sits in your driveway, and just because your license expires, you know, we don't see police forces coming in and taking you away as a person that's a criminal now just because you haven't renewed your driver's license. So we think the same latitude should be given to firearms owners here in Canada. I'd say they're the most law-abiding group that I've seen in Canada. They're very thorough with the way they store their firearms, and they're very diligent about how they do things. And again, we just don't want to see Grandpa Joe get penalized for something that was really just a simple, a small mistake that can be quickly rectified. But I would like to quote some people that are in the firearms industry, and they have massive amounts of members that belong to their associations that support this. I'm going to give a quote. Bob Zimmer's bill, I guess I'd say Member of Parliament from Prince George River's bill, reflects the reality that every firearms license in Canada is reviewed every day by police. The RCMP's continuous eligibility should equate to continuous entitlement to possess a firearm. Tony Bernardo, Canadian Shooting Sports Association. No law-abiding firearms owner should be criminalized for an expired firearms license. And that's really the crux of this whole thing, Mr. Speaker, is just a little bit, I think, fixing what is an administrative issue that's turning that administrative issue into something that's criminal. I think is not what's intended by what the law said. And I think there's other ways to get it done without turning Grandpa Joe into an outlaw. So a few questions that I've heard. Does my bill make obtaining firearms easier? Because it seems to be whenever we want a positive firearms piece of legislation, it always is taken to the furthest degree and perceived that now you can buy firearms at every corner store. Well, that's not the case, Mr. Speaker. It doesn't make it any easier at all. For you to legally purchase a firearm or ammunition in Canada, as most firearms owners know, you need to have a firearms license. That does not change with my bill. The firearms license, to obtain that, you need to go through the process of training, go through where you learn about firearms, how to safely store firearms, etc. My son just took his course. He's 19 and did his RPAL about a month ago, so he's getting his the right way and just waiting for it to come in. It also has a process of background checks that regularly updates the status of an individual. If there's ever an issue with a person that's possibly there's maybe family issues or mental issues, that's collected, and that person would not be able to purchase a firearm or possess that firearm. So that's a good part of, I think, our firearms licensing part in Canada and program in Canada. It's amongst the most stringent in the world. What does suspend mean in your bill? Suspend refers to the status of a license when the information hasn't been updated within the allotted 10-year period. So using Grandpa Joe again, let's say with my bill, if it passes, and I sure hope it does, is if his license expires, it goes into suspended mode. But that doesn't mean he becomes a criminal just by possessing that particular firearm in his home. What it means is he's just suspended from purchasing firearms and ammunition. So he can't buy new firearms and he can't buy ammunition only. That's what it suspends. So it's a temporary thing. When the information is provided, when Grandpa Joe goes back in and says, okay, I need to update my address or whatever, the suspension then is canceled. A key point here, Mr. Speaker, for all the firearms owners out there, and really the big issue with my bill, because I know there's a cautionary thought with the word suspend, what that means. A suspended license cannot be revoked simply because it is suspended. I think that's a key point. Once you've gone through the licensing process, you've done your work, you've done your training, you certainly don't forget all what you've just learned just because it's expired. You still know how to safely use and store that firearm. And again, a suspended license cannot be revoked simply because it is suspended. For too long, firearms owners have been treated as shady outlaws, I've said in my video. Makes a good graphic of the outlaw and the cowboy hat, I will say. Over an administrative issue, I want to make sure that no law-abiding firearms owners can be criminalized just for having an expired firearms license. And I think it goes back to, I think we need to have a good conversation about firearms. I think what a lot of people don't know about firearms owners in Canada is there's a huge demographic that's growing that want to own firearms and want to possess firearms and want to use them at a range or go hunting. And it's the demographic, the under 30 demographic. And I think there's a bit of that generation that's maybe seen firearms in different uses. Maybe their fathers, grandfathers, mothers and grandmothers they've seen them hunting with them, and they want to go experience that themselves. And we're even seeing growth in urban areas too, and it's legitimate firearms ownership and use in Canada. We're seeing dramatic growth. And I don't think, I think in Canada we need to, be rest assured that these people are law-abiding owners, they're licensed, they're trained, and not to be worried about that growth. It's a legitimate group that obeys the law and does it the right way, and I think Bill C-346 honors that and just makes, I think, our firearms laws in Canada just that much stronger. So I would like to recognize a few individuals. I can't recognize their names, but I have support within our party across the country. Members of caucus that have seconded my bill from Ontario, all the way across, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, all the way across that support this kind of legislation that's positive for our firearms owners and that really supports them well. But I would challenge the party across the way, it's government, and the NDP too, just to consider it seriously, that this is a demographic. There's Liberals that own firearms. I'm part of an association, the co-chair of the Parliamentary Caucus, and we represent all parties in our group, and we want to make sure that there's good laws that recognize our outdoor heritage in Canada, and that's sport shooting, that's hunting, fishing, and guiding and outfitting. And we want to, it's a group that we all represent, and I would hope and trust that the government across the way would support solid legislation like this that really just ensures that firearms owners aren't going to be needlessly criminalized because of some administrative issue. How much time, Mr. Speaker? 4 minutes, so got lots of time. But I think, in terms of, again, back to firearms ownership, I'm a firearms owner myself. I don't hunt as much as I'd like to. I fish. But I've had firearms owners. My children have all operated those firearms safely, and we actually have a event coming up next week where members of Parliament from all parties get to experience what a firearm feels like and safely operate that firearm. And part of what that day is for, maybe some people are cautious. I remember having one of my staff, she had never fired a firearm before. And it was really telling because she was a little concerned when we went out at first to the range, and then by the end of the day there was a big smile on her face. She understood that this can be done safely, it's a lot of fun. And I think the key thing is we have a great regime in Canada that sees our firearms owners operate those firearms safely and effectively. And again, just as I know in our party, we want to make sure that we don't see those laws become regressive. We've seen some moves just lately with UN markings and stuff, and I'm glad to see Minister across the way from Saskatchewan pull back on some of what's been talked about in UN markings. And I think just understanding, and I think it's been because of the firearms groups in Canada that have really let him know that that the laws need to be hospitable to firearms owners in Canada, not needlessly restrictive. We have a good regime already. We don't need to make it more restrictive. It's already very safe. And again, my desire by having this bill, C-346, which removes firearms licenses from expiring and also has a provision to relinquish your license, is meant to do just that and make our firearms laws in Canada stronger and not regressive. So I'm going to leave it there, Mr. Speaker, and I just want to say a special thanks to all firearms groups across Canada. We support you and we support your good work out there in training. I know there's a lot of organizations that, while we're having fun on a weekend and mowing the lawn, they're out there training people how to safely operate firearms, and they do this every weekend, 52 weeks a year. They're out there making sure that firearms can be safely operated in this country. So thanks to all those groups. Keep up the good work for all that are doing good work for the firearms communities in Canada, and look forward to hearing your comments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.